The most famous creepy cases in American history. The United States has been home to some of the worst serial killers in human history. These American serial killers have some of the highest number of victims in history, arguably making them the scariest human beings on the planet. Although there are many other prolific serial killers throughout the world, the United States has one of the largest groups of killers with 10 or more victims. Although some serial killers boast of hundreds of victims to their names, others have a more terrifying, if not lower number, of kills. With the number of victims that each serial killer on this list has, it's a wonder that these killers got away with it for as long as they could. Some of the killers had dozens of victims before anyone discovered that a single crime had been committed, while others were hunted by police for years. Which serial killers in the United States had the highest number of victims? How did they get away with the crimes for so long? What was it that finally got them caught? This list features the most prolific serial killers in U.S. history. 1. Wayne Williams. Almost 30 years ago, when Wayne Williams went on trial in two deaths that became known as the Atlanta child murders, DNA testing was not yet a staple of courtroom science. Now it is, and new results have implicated Williams in the death of at least one 11-year-old victim. When Patrick Baltazar's body was found dumped down a wooded slope behind an office park on February 13, 1981, a forensic scientist discovered two human scalp hairs inside the boy's shirt. At trial, scientists from both the FBI and Royal Canadian Mounted Police would testify that, under a microscope, the hairs were consistent with those of Wayne Williams. But that was only a matter of judgment, not exact science. In 2007, defense lawyers for Williams raised the question of DNA testing on dog hairs, which were on bodies of many of the 27 boys and young men found dead during the 2-year murder spree. At the same time, the judge decided to allow those two hairs found on Baltazar to be sent to the FBI's DNA laboratory at Quantico, Virginia. The laboratory report found the scalp hairs had the same type of DNA sequence as did Wayne Williams' own hair. "I don't think they said it was a match," Williams told CNN. "I think they said they could not rule out whoever the hairs were from as being the possible donor." But retired FBI scientist Harold Dedman, who testified about the hair findings in Williams' 1982 trial, and later became head of the FBI's DNA lab, said it was the strongest finding possible with this particular type of testing. "It would probably exclude 98% or so of the people in the world," Dedman said. Of 1,148 African American hair samples in the FBI's database, the FBI said only 29 had the same sequence. In other words, only 2.5 of every 100 African Americans. None of the Caucasian or Hispanic hair samples in the database had this sequence. When those samples are added in the total, then the odds rise to almost 130 to 1 against the hairs coming from any person other than Wayne Williams. The FBI report said this: Wayne Williams cannot be excluded as the source of the hair. The finding is not ironclad because the hairs were incomplete. The type of testing, called mitochondrial DNA, can trace only the maternal line. Only with nucleic DNA testing, which includes paternal lineage, could the results be absolutely conclusive. When CNN showed the DNA results to victim Baltazar's stepmother, Sheila Baltazar, she said, without a shadow of a doubt, "I really in my heart believe Wayne Williams killed Patrick Baltazar." Williams not only has denied he killed Patrick Baltazar, but has said he never met the boy. Yet testimony at trial established various fibers found on the Baltazar clothing could be traced to a bedroom carpet in Wayne Williams' home, his bedspread, a yellow blanket found under the bed, a leather jacket hanging in Wayne's closet, and a gray glove in his station wagon. There were also dog hairs on the Baltazar body which prosecution witnesses testified probably came from the Williams family's German Shepherd, Sheba. When those dog hairs were sent to a genetics laboratory in the School of Veterinary Medicine at the University of California, Davis, in 2007, the report said Sheba had the same DNA sequence. It said that DNA chain would be found in only 1 out of 100 dogs. The Baltazar case was included among 10 other deaths presented to the jury in Wayne Williams' trial. Although he was not charged in any of those, and was convicted of murdering 2 adults whose bodies were found in an Atlanta river in the spring of 1981. Scientists considered the hair and fiber evidence in the Baltazar murder to be among the strongest of their cases. However, the trial took place in the courts of Fulton County, which includes the largest part of Atlanta. Baltazar's body had been found just over the line in the DeKalb County portion of Atlanta, and trying to include his death among the Fulton County charges would have raised legal issues. 2. Jane Toppan. If history has taught us anything, it's that serial killers come in all shapes, sizes and nationalities. Oh! And genders, as well. Case in point, prolific serial killer Jane Toppan, born as Honora Kelly, known to law enforcement and the public as Jolly Jane, who, by her own admission, killed 33 people. Honora was quite possibly genetically predisposed to some degree of insanity. Her father Peter Kelly was rumored to have gone so mad as to sew his own eyelids shut while working as a tailor. Honora's mother Bridget was essentially a non-factor in raising her child, as she died of tuberculosis when Honora was still a young child. The future never looked all too bright for Honora Kelly. Her father, continuing his mental spiral, had both her and her sibling committed to the Boston Female Asylum, a facility that housed needy young ladies. Honora would never see her father again. Little is known of her time in the institution, though it is known that in November 1864, 2 years after being left in the care of those at the orphanage, Honora Kelly was placed as an indentured servant in the home of Mrs. Ann C. Toppan of Lowell, Massachusetts. Honora would eventually drop the name Kelly in exchange for Toppan. The name Jane soon stuck as well. Roughly 20 years after being rescued by the Toppan family, Jane's life took a strange turn. She began studying to become a nurse at Cambridge Hospital, and that opened a world of opportunity to begin to act on some of the darker things in Jane's mind. During her residency, she began to use her patients as guinea pigs, experimenting on them in numerous ways. She used abnormal doses of morphine and atropine, all the while examining her patients, and noting any changes in their nervous systems. But things didn't stop there. Toppan's depravity seemed to know no limits. Jane would often administer staggering amounts of sedatives to keep her patients immobilized while she'd then climb in bed with them. The lengths of sexual abuse that occurred in these states is not known. However, after her eventual arrest, she told officials that she did enjoy a sexual thrill being so intimately close to patients near death, coming back to life and then dying again. Jane had found a manner in which she could murder with little suspicion, and she seemed motivated by sexual desires, a statistically uncommon motive for female serial killers, who tend to murder for material gain. But Jane Toppan was not your common serial killer, and in 1889, after claiming a number of lives at Cambridge, she was soon transferred to the prestigious Massachusetts General Hospital, where her murderous ways continued. Eventually she lost her position at Massachusetts General, and thus made a brief move back to Cambridge, where she ran into trouble as a result of overprescribing opiates. And then made one final career adjustment. She began to work as a private nurse. It was a job she would flourish in financially, but her need for extermination would soon overtake her. Jane killed her landlords in 1895. 4 years later, she murdered her foster sister Elizabeth with strychnine. But the killing had just begun. 2 years later, Jane would move in with the elderly Alden Davis and his family in Catawmet. Her focal duties required she take care of the man, as he'd already lost his wife, whom Jane actually killed. Within weeks, Jane had murdered Davis and 2 of his daughters. With living quarters sabotaged by her own thirst for death, Jane moved back home, where she soon found herself being courted by her late foster sister's husband. Jane would later kill the man's sister, then poison him in order to impress him, for some odd reason, by nursing him back to health. Jane's strange behavior, and the pile of bodies left in her wake, soon caught up with her, as the surviving members of the Davis family ordered toxicology reports on Alden Davis' youngest daughter, one of Jane's many victims. These toxicology reports were conclusive: she had been poisoned, and there were no doubts as to who was responsible. Police immediately began a hunt for Toppan. And on October 29, 1901, she was arrested for murder. Jane would never be a free woman again, as within a year she'd confessed to 31 murders. But this story doesn't end without one big twist for good measure. Jane, or Jolly Jane, as she'd become known, would face a jury who would ultimately determine the prolific murderer's fate. Somehow, Jolly Jane Toppan was found not guilty by reason of insanity. On June 23, Jane exited Barnstable County Courthouse, headed for the Taunton Insane Hospital. It is here that Jane's final days would inch away, no longer as a caregiver, but just a dangerous and damaged patient in her own need of care. She hung on to life until 1938, departing this world as an 80-year-old serial killer who evaded prison bars for decades, despite exterminating more than 30 lives and forever damaging the lives of her victims' families forever. 3. Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy was born on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont, and grew up to be a charming, articulate, and intelligent young man. However, by the time he was a teenager living in Washington, Bundy already exhibited signs of the sadistic serial killer he would become. In interviews he recalled being antisocial and wandering the streets looking for discarded pornography or open windows through which he could spy on unsuspecting women. He also had an extensive juvenile record for theft that was dismissed when he turned 18. By 1972, he had graduated college and showed great promise in a career in law or politics. That career would be cut short though when he discovered his true passion, viciously assaulting his earliest confirmed victim in 1974. He tended to prey on young and attractive college women, first near his home in Washington, then moving east to Utah, Colorado, and finally in Florida. Bundy would prey on these women with a ruse, often wearing his arm in a sling or his leg in a fake cast and walking on crutches. He would then use his charm and fake disability to convince his victims to help him carry books or unload objects from his car. He was also known to impersonate authority figures, such as police officers and firefighters, to gain victims' trust before he attacked. Once they got to his 1968 tan Volkswagen Beetle, he would strike them over the head with a crowbar or pipe. After hitting his victims, he would immobilize them with handcuffs and force them into the vehicle. Bundy had removed the passenger seat and often stored it in the back seat or trunk, leaving an empty space on the floor for his victim to lie out of sight as he drove away. Bundy was able to rape and murder scores of women this way. He typically strangled or bludgeoned his victims as well as mutilating them after death. He then prolonged the events by returning to visit the corpses at their dump sites or even taking them home in order to gain further sexual gratification. In some cases, he even shockingly displayed their decapitated heads in his apartment and slept with their corpses until putrefaction made it unbearable. As body counts rose and witness descriptions spread, several people contacted authorities to report Bundy as a potentially matching suspect. However, police consistently ruled him out based on his seemingly upstanding character and clean-cut appearance. He was able to avoid detection even longer by learning how to leave virtually no evidence that could be traced by the still rudimentary forensics techniques of the 1970s. Bundy was finally arrested for the first time on August 16, 1975, in Utah after fleeing from a patrol car. A search of the vehicle yielded masks, handcuffs, rope, and other nefarious items, but nothing definitively linking him to the crimes. He was released but remained under constant surveillance, until he was arrested again for the kidnapping and assault of one of his victims several months later. Bundy escaped custody a year later after being transferred from Utah to Colorado for another trial but was recaptured within a week. He then managed to escape a second time on December 30, 1977, at which point he was able to reach Florida and resume his killing spree. He raped or murdered at least 6 more victims, 5 of them Florida State University students, before he was apprehended again for a traffic violation on February 15, 1978. He was finally sentenced to death and died in the electric chair on January 24, 1989. At the time of his execution, Bundy had confessed to 30 murders, though the actual number of his victims remains unknown. Ted Bundy's Volkswagen is on display at the Alcatraz East Crime Museum in Tennessee. 4. Dean Corll. With the aid of 2 young accomplices, serial killer Dean Corll carried out a brutal series of murders in the early 1970s, that continues to haunt Houston, Texas to this day. The man nicknamed the Candyman was responsible for at least 28 killings over a 3-year span, before he met his own demise at the hands of one of his young protégés. Dean Corll was born in 1939, into a contentious family. His parents divorced, remarried and divorced again while he was still a child. His mother remarried, to a new man, Jay Quest, when Dean was 16, and the whole family moved to Vidor, Texas, where Mrs. Corll and her second husband started Pecan Prince, a small candy company. Dean Corll and his brother Stanley both worked for the business, operating out of the family garage, while attending school. Most of the family's business was in Houston, so Corll's mother and stepfather relocated there and opened up a candy store. After he graduated from high school, Dean Corll relocated to Houston as well, where he continued to work for the family business. In 1963, Corll's mother and stepfather divorced, and his mother opened up her own candy shop called Corll Candy Company. Soon after opening the new business, a teenage male employee complained that Dean Corll made inappropriate sexual advances toward him. Corll's mother fired the young man. Dean Corll spent almost a year in the U.S. Army in 1964-1965, and he realized during this time that he was a homosexual. After his military service, Corll returned to Houston and resumed working at the family candy company. Corll earned the nickname the Candyman because he frequently handed out free candy to young kids in the area. Corll also befriended many young boys in the area, some of whom would hang out around the candy shop. Corll befriended a 12-year-old boy named David Brooks in 1967. The boy was from a broken home, and he initially looked up to Corll as a father figure. After a while, the friendship between the two developed into a sexual relationship, in that Corll would pay young Brooks for sexual favors. In 1968, Corll's mother closed the family candy company and moved to Colorado, so Corll switched occupations, finding work as an electrician. In 1970, Corll and his young friend David also embarked on a new venture, murder. With the help of Brooks, Dean Corll would lure young boys and men, mostly from the low-income neighborhood of Houston Heights, into his car with the promise of a party at his house. Once at Corll's house, there was no escape. The young boys were supplied with drugs and alcohol, then strapped to a torture board that was 2.5 feet wide and 8 feet long. The victims were forced to endure unspeakable horrors, as Corll would rape, torture, and eventually murder the youngsters by strangulation or gunshot. Corll buried the many bodies in 4 separate locations. In 1971, Corll recruited another young boy from the area to help him and Brooks lure victims to their deaths. His name was Wayne Henley, and he was only 15 years old when his association with Corll and Brooks started. Corll offered Brooks and Henley $200 for each victim they supplied him. Henley later told authorities he participated in the grisly scheme because his family needed the money. The group of killers did not discriminate. Some of the murder victims were hitchhikers, some were kids just minding their own business, and some were friends of Brooks and Henley, unknowingly lured to their deaths by their trusted peers. People began to notice that an alarming number of young people were disappearing from the Houston Heights neighborhood. In March 1973, Corll moved to Pasadena, a suburb of Houston, and for months he did not murder any young boys. But in June and July, 1973, Corll, assisted by Henley and Brooks, ramped up his killing at a frenetic pace, murdering 7 people. Corll killed his final victim on August 3, 1973, a 13-year-old boy David Brooks had abducted for him. 4 days later, on August 7, Henley brought a couple of his teenaged friends, Tim Curley and Rhonda Williams, with him to Corll's house. Corll was furious that Henley had brought a girl into his house, and the two argued out of earshot of Curley and Williams until, suddenly, Corll seemed to calm down. Henley returned to the party, and the 3 kids drank, smoked pot, and huffed paint fumes until they all passed out. While they were unconscious, Corll tied up Curley, Williams, and Henley. When Henley awoke, Corll, his mentor and partner in crime, told him he was going to kill him for bringing a female into his house. Henley begged for his life, eventually convincing Corll that he would help him murder Curley and Williams if he was untied. Dean Corll relented and released Henley from his bindings. The 2 murderers carried the teens to Corll's bedroom and strapped them down onto the torture boards. Corll began to beat and torture Curley, and he ordered Henley to cut off Williams' clothing with a knife. Rhonda Williams awoke and pleaded with Wayne Henley for her life. Something in Henley's misguided brain snapped. He turned and told Dean Corll, the man who had taught him to kill, "I can't go on any longer. I can't have you kill all my friends." Henley grabbed a gun and threatened Corll, who approached Henley, shouting, "Kill me, Wayne." Henley shot Corll several times, killing him and ending the murder spree. Henley freed Williams and Curley, and the three called the police. When officers took them to the station, Wayne Henley decided to unburden himself, and he confessed to the 3-year murder spree that he had helped facilitate. Henley led police to the burial sites, and 28 victims were identified. Wayne Henley and David Brooks stood trial and both were sentenced to life in prison. Today, Henley and Brooks are both in their 60s, and they continue to serve their sentences in Texas prisons. 5. Juan Corona. A California man who was once known as the nation's worst serial killer was again denied parole Monday, after he admitted his guilt for the first time before the parole board. Juan Corona said he murdered and mutilated 25 farm workers 4 decades ago, because they were trespassing in the orchards north of Sacramento, said Sutter County Assistant District Attorney Jana McClung. Parole officials decided Corona can try again in 5 years, McClung said after the 2-hour hearing. It was Corona's 7th bid for parole from Corcoran State Prison. Corona previously made incriminating statements to a prison psychologist. However, this is the first time that I'm aware of that he made that admission to the full board. He said it was trespassing and they were winos, McClung said. He just doesn't seem to realize that what he did was wrong. Corona, 77, has been diagnosed with dementia and mental illness. No family members of his victims attended the hearing. Prosecutors said Corona targeted victims who had few relatives and likely wouldn't be missed. "We have had no contact with survivors for 2 decades now," District Attorney Carl Adams said before the hearing. The people who he killed were farm laborers who were itinerant. Most of them didn't have relatives who could be contacted back in the 70s at the time of trial. 4 of the bodies have never been identified. The bodies of 14 of Corona's victims were never claimed by family members after they were discovered in 1971. Corona, a farm labor contractor with a history of mental illness, was convicted of stabbing the men, hacking open their heads and burying their remains near Yuba City, 40 miles north of Sacramento. He told the parole board he stabbed his first victim with a kitchen knife, shot his second, and killed the rest with a machete, McClung said. However, there is no record of any of his victims being shot, she said, raising questions about whether there was another possible victim or if the shooting was a product of Corona's fading mind. Corona walked unaided into the hearing, but his dementia was evident during his comments, McClung said. He was a little bit all over the road, she said. He did start trembling a little bit. Corona's attorney, Leon Harris III of Bakersfield, declined to comment before the hearing. Corona's first conviction in 1973 was overturned on appeal, but he was convicted again in 1982, and sentenced to 25 concurrent life sentences. He was not eligible for the death penalty because California's capital punishment law had been ruled unconstitutional at the time. It was the most deadly killing spree in U.S. history, until John Wayne Gacy Jr. was convicted in 1980, of murdering 33 young men and boys in his Chicago home. Gacy was executed in 1994 in Illinois. Investigators found a machete, a meat cleaver, a double-bladed axe and a wooden club, all stained with blood, in Corona's home, along with a ledger book containing the names of 7 of the victims. Corona is a Mexican national and native of Jalisco, Mexico. His attorney argued that his age and lack of recent violent acts means he should be paroled, said McClung, who countered that his dementia and apparent lack of understanding and remorse means he is still dangerous. The concern could be, would he go out and do this again? Because he doesn't seem to have an understanding of what he did the first time, she said. 6. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. He may be America's most prolific serial killer, yet the name Gary Ridgway, as known as the Green River Killer, is not as well known, when compared to the many other murderers, who have haunted our nation's headlines. Convicted of killing 49 women, over the course of 2 decades, Ridgway has confessed to killing almost twice that number, and admitted in later statements, that he claims so many lives he lost count. A man of contradictions, Ridgway was a door-to-door proselytizer, who read the Bible aloud both at work and at home. He was a married man, twice by the early 1980s, when his murder spree began. At the same time, Ridgway regularly frequented prostitutes. Many of the killer's victims were sex workers, whom he targeted, because he hated most of them, and they were easy to pick up. He also preyed upon young runaways, and other women in vulnerable positions. Ridgway had sex with many of his victims, before he killed them. He also returned to the disposal site, to have sex with the bodies. The majority of the murders occurred near Seattle, and Tacoma, Washington. Many of the bodies were then dumped along the banks of the Green River, a 65-mile stretch of water due south of Seattle, that earned the killer his nickname. In order to pick up his victims, Ridgway would make small talk, and show them photographs of his son. In truth, according to Ridgway himself, he just want to, get the victim in the vehicle, and eventually kill her. Ridgway's victims were usually strangled, either by hand or by ligature. In his confessions, Ridgway said that he turned to ligature, because he was afraid that the defensive wounds his victims, sometimes left on his arms, would give him away. Ridgway intentionally dumped the bodies in out-of-the-way places, once leaving Washington state, entirely to dispose of two of the bodies near Portland, Oregon, and confuse the police. He also left false clues around the dump sites, to throw off suspicion, including gum and cigarettes, that had been used by other people. This partially explains why it took authorities until 2001, almost 20 years after his first confirmed murder, to arrest Ridgway, when DNA evidence finally linked him to 4 of the victims. Though he became a suspect in the case early on, Ridgway took, and apparently passed, a polygraph test in 1984. Later, however, a quality control review determined that he had actually failed the test, and that it hadn't been caught at the time. In 1985, he met Judith Mawson, who would become his third wife in 1988. During that time, his number of murders dropped off substantially. Though she was unaware of Ridgway's murderous predilections until after his arrest, Mawson would later state that she thought she had saved lives by being his wife and making him happy. When Ridgway was finally arrested in 2001, it was initially only in connection with 4 murders. 3 more murders were added, after forensic scientists connected spray paint traces found on the bodies of victims with a type of paint used at the Kenworth truck factory, where Ridgway worked as a painter. In order to avoid the death penalty, Ridgway agreed to a plea bargain in which he admitted to a much larger number of murders, helping police find the missing bodies of several of his victims. He initially pleaded guilty to 48 murders, 42 of which were on the list of probable victims of the Green River Killer. An additional murder of an unidentified woman, discovered in 2003, was added to his convictions, giving him the most confirmed kills of any serial killer in American history. In his statements, Ridgway confessed to claiming still more lives, as many as 71. Chillingly, he referred to killing young women as his career. 7. Donald Harvey. A distinct odor, the scent of burned almonds, turned the routine autopsy into a murder investigation, and then into a probe of one of the country's worst serial killers. The dead man, John Powell, 44, had been in a motorcycle accident in July 1986, that landed him at Cincinnati's Daniel Drake Memorial Hospital, with massive head injuries. For months, he was unresponsive, suffering seizures, embolisms, pneumonia and bed sores. No one, not even his wife, was surprised when, in early March 1987, Powell took his last breath. There were no suspicions of foul play. The man had been lingering in the margins of life for months. Who would bother to kill him? All that changed with one whiff of burnt almonds, which is the telltale odor of cyanide. Detectives soon turned their attention to the last person to see Powell alive, hospital orderly Donald Harvey, 35. Police brought him in for questioning. It did not take long for him to break. "I did it," Harvey admitted. He calmly told of how he poured half a vial of cyanide into Powell's feeding tube, and flushed the rest of the poison down the toilet. When asked why, Harvey said, "I felt sorry for him, and for his family. It seemed a classic case of mercy killing. Harvey was charged with a single murder, and that's how it might have stayed had it not been for the observation of a television newsman, wrote attorney William Whalen in defending Donald Harvey. WCPO-TV anchor Pat Minarson questioned the reporter at the scene, asking if there would be any investigation into other deaths at the hospital. The answer, on the day of Harvey's arraignment, was number. Then Minarson started digging, talking to about 50 Drake nurses, patients and staffers. He found evidence of a string of suspicious deaths. Minarson contacted Whalen, Harvey's lawyer, and asked him to question his client about whether Powell was his only victim. The answer was startling. WCPO ran a half-hour special that raised the possibility that as many as 70 or more patients had died from Harvey's ministrations. Born April 15, 1952, Harvey's young life was filled with all kinds of people, events, and pathologies that are a formula for growing up a serial killer. His family was dirt poor, his parents had knockdown screaming fights, and as a young boy he had fallen several times, hitting his head. Older cousins sexually abused him. He took an axe to the only pet he ever had, a chick. At 18, he went to visit an elderly uncle, who was convalescing in Marymount Hospital in London, Kentucky, and found his life calling, caring for lost causes. He charmed his way into a job there. Before long, the hospital's death rate started to rise. Harvey would later confess that his first victim at Marymount was a nasty old drunk, Logan Evans, 88, a stroke victim. On May 30, 1970, Evans was thrashing about, covered in his own filth. As Harvey tried to tend to him, Evans grabbed him, smearing feces on the orderly's face. So Harvey smothered him with a pillow. What followed was a string of deaths of the hospital's most frail patients. More than a dozen died on Harvey's watch, before he quit in March 1971. A few months later, he joined the Air Force but was discharged in 9 months when revelations surfaced about a previous burglary arrest. For a time, Harvey bounced from one hospital job to the next. In his private life, he advanced his studies in witchcraft, and his activities with neo-Nazi groups. During this period, he began a relationship with a hairdresser, Corll Hueller. Soon Hueller wasn't feeling so well, and people around him were even worse. A friend came down with hepatitis. 3 neighbors and Hueller's father and brother-in-law died. No one made the observation that the one common denominator was the Harvey. All had had one or more meals prepared by him. Even a neighbor's old dog died after Harvey took care of him. No one probed too deeply into his background and the history of mysterious deaths at other medical facilities. When he applied for a job at Drake, no questions were asked regarding the reason for his dismissal. Carrying a gun from his last job at the Cincinnati VA hospital. In February 1986, Harvey started working in long-term care at Drake. Within 2 months, patients began dying. As with the other killings, no one really questioned what had pushed these patients into the afterlife. They were all very ill, and it didn't take much to do them in. Harvey used different methods: smothering, rat poison, arsenic, to snuff out 24 patients in 13 months. By the time Powell's murder put an end to his deadly hobby, Harvey had been at it for 18 years. He confessed to killing somewhere between 70 and 87 people, but it was impossible to substantiate that claim. He did it out of compassion for their suffering, to put people out of their misery, Harvey insisted, although many of the killings were clearly provoked by rage, hatred or jealousy. In August 1987, Harvey pleaded guilty to 24 counts of murder, and received 4 consecutive sentences of 20 years to life. Killings in other hospitals earned him another 11 life sentences. The Angel of Death will be in his 90s, before his first possible parole in 2043. 8. John Wayne Gacy. A jolly sight at neighborhood get-togethers, successful contractor and amateur clown John Wayne Gacy, Jr. seemed to lead the ideal suburban life, until he was convicted of slaughtering 33 young men. It was the 1978 disappearance of Robert Biest that finally led authorities to Gacy's modest Illinois home outside of Chicago. It was there, in Gacy's foul-smelling basement, that police unearthed one of the most disturbing murder cases in American history. Tim Cahill details how police finally caught the killer clown in his true crime book, Buried Dreams. Rob Biest was an A student, a standout gymnast, an ambitious, intelligent boy who was very close to his family, not at all the sort of kid who runs away from home. Certainly not at 9 o'clock in the evening, after putting in 4 hours on his part-time job. Certainly not on the night of his mother's 46th birthday party, a party that had been postponed until Rob finished work. The boy was last seen on his way to talk to a contractor about a summer job. The contractor's name was John Gacy. That night, Rob Pius simply disappeared. Suburban Des Plaines police, investigating the case, put a tracer on John Wayne Gacy, Jr., and found that he had been convicted of sodomy, in Iowa, 10 years previous. That offense had involved a 15-year-old boy. 10 days later, after an intensive investigation, John Gacy was arrested. He insisted that he knew nothing about the Pius boy's disappearance. The interrogation was cut short when the suspect complained of severe chest pains and said that he had a history of heart trouble. Officers rushed Gacy to Holy Family Hospital in Des Plaines. Meanwhile, a search warrant was obtained for Gacy's house. Officers and evidence technicians, representatives of the Des Plaines Police Department, the Cook County Sheriff's Police, and the state's attorney's detail, began arriving at the Brick Ranch house about 7 that night. They were looking for evidence of a kidnapping. They feared they might find evidence of a murder. The front room of the house at 8213 Summerdale was choked with plants, and there were several pictures of sad-faced clowns on the wall. In a business office just off the living room, officers found several sets of meticulous records detailing Gacy's business, as well as photos showing the chunky contractor shaking hands with the mayor of Chicago and with the wife of the President of the United States. In a rec room, hidden near the pool table, officers found a large vibrating dildo crusted with disagreeable evidence that it had been used in some recent anal penetration. There were a number of books and magazines about homosexuality, and several of them featured older men in Congress with young boys. Ominously, in the attic, investigators found some wallets, and the information inside proved that they belonged to young men, teenagers. Toward the front of the house, in a living room closet, police found a trapdoor leading down into a dark, dirt-floored crawl space, which seemed to be flooded. The beam of a floodlight pointed into the open hatchway was reflected on the surface of the dank water that stood a foot deep below. Cook County evidence technician Daniel Ginty saw a cord just under the hatchway door. He plugged the cord into a nearby socket. There was a rumble of machinery, and a sump pump, somewhere in the murky depths, began pumping water out of the darkness. A dank, putrid smell emanated from the crawl space, the smell of sewage and something worse, something officers recognized as the odor of a morgue. It took about 15 minutes for the crawl space to drain, and in that time, evidence technicians searching the garage and work shed found a number of wallets containing IDs belonging to several young men, as well as some items of personal jewelry a teenage boy might wear. It didn't seem possible that all these boys had just happened to leave their clothes, their jewelry, and their wallets at John Gacy's house. Daniel Ginty now had an idea of what he might find in the crawl space. When the water had been flushed away, Ginty dropped through the hatchway, into the mud. There was no ladder. The crawl space was only about 2.5 feet deep. Ginty dragged a small shovel and fire department floodlight with him. He crawled, on his hands and knees, toward the south wall, dropping to his belly to get under the center support beam that ran the length of the house. In the southeast corner of the house, up against the foundation, Ginty could see 2 long depressions, parallel to the wall. They were about 6 feet long and 1.5 feet wide, the size of graves. Ginty crawled to the northwest corner of the crawl space, then moved to the southwest, where he noted 3 small puddles, about the size of ashtrays. One of the puddles was a dark, murky, purple color. The other 2 were filled with hundreds of thin red worms, about 2 inches long, and when Ginty shone the floodlight on them, they burrowed into the soft mud. It was there, in the southwest corner of the crawl space, that Ginty decided to make his first excavation. He knelt, nearly doubled over, and plunged his trenching tool into the mud. An unbearably putrid odor burst up out of the earth and filled the crawl space. The second shovel full of earth contained a clot of adipocere, white, soapy, rotting flesh, almost like lard. A product of decomposition, adipocere takes 12 months or more to form. The body could not be Rob Pius's. Gacy, it seemed, could possibly be guilty of more than one murder. Bundy took one last scoop of mud, hit something hard, and pried up what looked like a human arm bone. Skeletal remains, definitely not the body of a boy last seen alive 11 days ago. Bundy shouted to Lieutenant Joseph Cousinsack of the Des Plaines Police Department upstairs, "Charge him." "Murder," Cousinsack yelled. "Repeat that." "I found one." "Is it highest number?" "I don't think so. It's been here too long." Another evidence technician and an investigator dropped into the crawl space. The odor, in that damp and confined area, was almost as unbearable as the thought of what the crawl space contained. "I think this place is full of kids," Bundy said. In the northeast corner of the crawl space under John Gacy's house, the officers found more puddles, all swarming with thin red worms. There, 2 feet from the north wall, they uncovered what appeared to be a knee bone. The flesh was so desiccated that at first they thought it was blue jean material. South of that dig, Bundy uncovered some human hair in the soil. The second evidence technician dug along the south wall and found 2 long bones, human leg bones, both very blackened. Rather than disturb any more remains that might complicate identification procedures or destroy evidence, the officers decided to quit the crawl space and call the coroner. At about the same time, John Gacy was being released from Holy Family Hospital. He had been thoroughly examined, and doctors could find no evidence of a heart attack. Gacy's pulse was a little high, that was all. Under heavy guard, detectives had been told what the search uncovered. Gacy was returned to the Des Plaines police station, where he was arrested and charged with murder. Gacy signed a card waiving his Miranda rights, then spoke to detectives David Hockmeister and Michael Albrecht. "My house," Gacy said. "Did you go into the crawl space?" "Yeah," Albrecht said. "We did." "I used lime," Gacy said. "That's what it was for." "What was it for, John?" Albrecht asked. "For the sewage, the dampness." "For what you found there?" "A mugshot, taken at the time, shows a stuporous, uncomprehending man." Gacy's puffy face and undistinguished features look slack, as if the bones of his skull have no substance to them. He stares into the camera, and his eyes are glassy, dull, and dead. He looks like a man insane. 9. Ronald Dominique. Ronald Dominique spent much of his youth in the small bayou community of Thibodaux, LA. Thibodaux sits between New Orleans and Baton Rouge and is the type of community where everyone knows a little about each other. He attended Thibodaux High School, where he was in the glee club and sang in the chorus. Classmates who remember Dominique say he was ridiculed for being homosexual during his teen years, but at the time he never admitted he was gay. As he got older, he seemed to live in 2 worlds. There was the Dominique who was helpful to his neighbors in the small trailer parks where he lived. Then there was the Dominique who cross-dressed and did bad impersonations of Patti LaBelle at the local gay club. Neither world embraced him, and among the gay community, many remember him as someone who was not particularly well liked. Through most of his adulthood, Dominique struggled financially and would end up living with his mother or other relatives. In the weeks before his arrest, he was living with his sister in a single-wide trailer. He was suffering from declining health, having been hospitalized for a severe heart condition and forced to use a cane to walk. Outwardly, there was a side to Dominique who enjoyed helping people. He joined the Lions Club just months before his arrest, and spent Sunday afternoons calling out bingo numbers to senior citizens. The membership director said he was well liked by everyone he had met through the Lions Club. Maybe Dominique had finally found a place he felt accepted. What sparked Dominique to move from the comfort of his sister's home to the dismal surroundings of a shelter for the homeless is uncertain. Some suspect the family grew uncomfortable by the 24-hour police surveillance, and Dominique, knowing he was soon to be caught, moved away to avoid getting his family involved in his arrest. In the southern state of Louisiana, USA, bodies had been piling up for 9 years. By March 2005, there were 22 unsolved killings. All victims were male, aged between 16 and 46. Most were homeless. The victims had been bound and strangled or asphyxiated. Some had been raped and several were found partially clothed or barefoot. Many of the bodies had been dumped in sugarcane fields in bodies of water known as bayous, and in ditches in remote areas. A special task force was set up. All feared they had a serial killer on their hands. A year passed and no arrests were made. Then, on October 15, 2006, another victim was discovered. And soon after, in December 2006, an ex-convict told his parole officer he'd encountered a man who'd wanted to tie him up as part of a sexual tryst with the man's wife. He'd gone back to the man's trailer, but felt uncomfortable, so he'd left. The task force investigated. Would they catch the Bayou serial killer? Armed with a description of the trailer, police traced Ronald Joseph Dominique. He seemed an unlikely serial killer though. Tubby and unassuming, Ronald walked with a cane and was helpful to neighbors. He even volunteered as a bingo caller at an old folks' home. Dominique was arrested and gave a DNA sample. The results connected him to two unsolved murders from 1998 and 1999. The two male victims had both been asphyxiated. One had been raped. Shockingly, Dominique confessed to murdering 23 men over 9 years. He admitted approaching men and offering them money for sex. If the victim wasn't gay, Dominique would produce a picture of a woman he claimed was his wife, saying he wanted someone to have sex with her. He would then take the man back to his trailer where he tied him up and raped him, before killing him and dumping his body. After 9 years of brutal murders, the police had finally caught this callous killer. But what had turned him that way? Born on January 9, 1964, in the Bayou Blue area of Houma, Dominique had a difficult upbringing. Although he was reportedly openly gay as an adult, he never admitted it as a teenager. He sang in the chorus of his glee club at school, where he was ridiculed for his camp manner. Age 21, in 1985, Dominique was arrested and charged with telephone harassment. He pleaded guilty, paid a fine and costs. Then, in 1996, he was arrested for forcible rape and sentenced to 3 months in prison. It's believed that it was during this incarceration that Dominique claimed he had decided it'd be safer to kill his victims and leave no witnesses. But was he only killing to stop himself being reported? Or was he beginning to take pleasure in the cruelty? As his violence progressed, Dominique approached people in gay bars, or men walking streets or riding bikes. If they refused to be tied up, he'd let them go. He callously dumped the bodies of the dead men locally. In September 2008, Ronald Joseph Dominique formally admitted 8 murders. He was given 8 life sentences.